I would give UFC 244 a B minus or a C plus, and here's why. For how stacked it was, for how exciting the card was, and for the ways that it ended. I mean, let's be honest. Every single person initially wanted Nate Diaz to continue on fighting. And then once we saw the particulars and we actually saw how bad the eye was, then we were like, okay. And I know a lot of people changed their standpoint on that. But in the initial moment of watching that main event, it was like, oh my gosh, like we were waiting for a 5-round fight between these two. And then to get all of the other things that happen, I mean, just sort of more anticlimactic. I mean, nobody's talking about Blago Ivanov versus Derek Lewis. And Derek Lewis absolutely won that fight, and that was a great fight. But for some reason, nobody's talking about it. There was something missing. And maybe it was a spectacular call-out. Maybe it was a spectacular walkout. Maybe it was more personality.
A spectacular anything. Sorry to cut you off, but a spectacular anything.
Yeah, it was just a very... The word that I actually wrote down for this was anticlimactic. Everything that we had built this up to be for the last 3 months, because that's when Diaz had fought, or 2 months actually. For the last 2 months, I mean, the UFC 244 has been the card that everybody's talking about, and it was stacked, and we were ready. I mean, episode 11 was completely a UFC 244 show. And for it to end the way that it did, and for the lack of spectacular things to happen when we have tons of fighters who have made incredible things happen in their careers, we just didn't get those things.
Well, do you remember when we were sitting down in my living room watching the fight, and there got to a point where we just kind of looked at each other and we said, man, this is kind of going by fast, right? Mm-hmm. Like we're already at Gastelum Till. We were bored. Yeah. We were literally bored. We were watching the main card and we were going, okay, now what?
Yeah.
You know, we were waiting for the big thing to happen, the big moment, the big UFC 244 thing that we're going to remember forever. And sadly, we didn't have it. The grade I'm going to give UFC 244 is a D. Wow. Barely passing. Here's why. Barely passing as a UFC pay-per-view event. Okay. That felt so much more like a free fight or an ESPN Plus UFC Fight Night fight, because you had the main card that felt like the undercard. Big names, could have been a lot of fun, but it was just kind of, okay, when does the main event start? When does the main event start? That's all we do when we watch UFC Fight Nights, right? UFC Fight Night, Yair Rodriguez, Jeremy Stevens. I can't even remember who was on the undercard or who was in the main card other than those two, right? The whole time we're just going, okay, yeah, good fight, main card, let's go.
And that's actually a great point, though probably the craziest thing that happened was, and the biggest shock was, I mean, Gregor Gillespie and Kevin Lee was one thing, but without a doubt, Corey Anderson knocking out Johnny Walker, and that was on the undercard. I mean, that was for me. I was watching that part from home, but I was going, oh my gosh, like that just happened, like Johnny Walker just got knocked out. After that, it was really just, okay, this is kind of, this is just happening.
As far as impactful moments of the night, you're right. Corey Anderson, an undercard fighter, stole the night. Stole the show away from George Masvidal and Nate Diaz, albeit it wasn't their fault. It was a doctor stoppage. Sure. I mean, that was still a fantastic fight, but you're right. The undercard fighter of Corey Anderson literally stole UFC 244.
And I guess the question is, why do we both have this weird thought this weird feeling in our minds? And I think part of it is one, obviously the doctor stoppage, and then the fights before that on the main card. But also, was it The Rock coming out? Was it the BMF belt that everybody is saying is so lame? But Dana keeps saying, oh, it's our most expensive belt yet. It's our heaviest belt yet. It's all these things. But it gave sort of a fun feeling where the fight almost didn't matter. And was that because it wasn't for a title? Because it wasn't for a legitimate title, I guess I should say. All of that is up for grabs, and maybe this is a learning experience. I think Dana says, I don't want to run it back for this exact reason. He left with a sour taste in his mouth going, oh man, unless it's Conor, it can't be a title. It can't be a main event without Conor if it's not for a title belt.
I totally agree. And like I said, I'm going to talk a ton about this in my final thoughts, so I don't want to get too much into it. But you're absolutely right. The hype, in my opinion, ruined this fight. Yeah. You had a WWE star bringing out a belt that it didn't look cool. It didn't look like your traditional...
Everybody's ripping it online.
It didn't look like your cultural, like your traditional, your real UFC Octagon gold belt. It looked like it was a toy, and it felt like we were watching a WWE event. No offense to any of our, listeners who enjoy the WWE, but
stop listening.
Yeah. And with that, we're going to go into round 3.